All right, welcome back to the Morning Update Show. And we have Council Member Mosqueda. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm
Doing
good.
good.
Well,
Good to see you.
yeah, welcome to the Morning Update Show.
Thank you. It's an incredible honor to be here. I would have been so happy to meet you, and we'll do so next time in person. It is always a treat these days to socially distance and see people in person. So let me know next time I'll be there and see you in person.
Will do. So I know our time is short. We got a lot of things to cover. So a lot of stuff I already got in video for you. I went to your Facebook page yesterday and I saw a short clip right there. We'll play it right now and I'll follow up with you.
Hey everyone, it's Teresa Mosqueda, Seattle City Council member and your budget chair for the 2021 budget deliberations. Along with the city, your voice as residents, and all of the constituents we hear from, we're working on setting a budget priority that mirrors what our city needs right now.
Okay, Council Member, what does our city need right now?
Our city needs housing. In order for us to actually be healthy, people say you have to stay home. We cannot comply with a stay home, stay healthy ordinance when we don't have enough housing in the city for all of the residents. We need housing because we're in the fifth year of a housing crisis. And as the finance and housing chair, I think housing is the root of how we can create economic stability, how we can create greater health and health equity, and get to the social determinants of health. What our city needs right now, as well as investments in infrastructure to create more equity and opportunities across our city. As you all know, in order to stay safe, you need sidewalks, you need bridges that don't collapse. You need piers that are going to stay erected. We need to invest in the core infrastructure of our city and do it in an equitable way. In the south end to the north end, we have communities that we have said, go out, take a walk, be healthy, walk your kids to the park. But there's no sidewalks. There's no sidewalks for strollers or walkers. And there's no way for people to stay safe on these streets. So infrastructure wise, we have a lot of investments that need to be made. And from a public health perspective, we need ongoing investments, not just in COVID, which we absolutely need to make sure that people can weather this economic crisis that has not been created by COVID, but has been made worse by COVID. The fact that people need rental assistance, they need housing stability, they need foreclosure assistance, they need small business and childcare support. Absolutely, we need that from a public health perspective. But we also need to recognize that the crisis of over policing and racism in our city is a public health crisis. And those are the issues that we must address in this budget and begin, I think, making some major investments and trying to correct historic wrongs. Obviously, it can't be done in 1 year, but those are the issues that are being demanded of us. And I don't know if y'all had a chance to watch Town Hall the other day, but there was
Yeah, I saw you on there, 150
did.
calls. You know what I'm saying? 5 hours. I mean, I took a few naps.
It was a really good conversation. The last thing that the author of The Color of Law said was we also have to have elected officials who are going to stand up and be responsive to the calls for action, from civil rights to investing in infrastructure to investing in public safety, as the civil rights movement is demanding of us to do now. We have to do it, and it's really powerful moment to be able to be in a position to bring those voices into City Hall and help have that guide us.
All right, so next up here, and we're going to circle back around on a few things because especially when you're talking about these social justice issues. But let's talk about Jumpstart. Here's a clip from a few months ago, but it kind of outlines the Jumpstart program.
The proposed new payroll tax is the jumpstart Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda says Seattle needs to address homelessness and affordable housing shortages, inequities, and food insecurity, as well as small businesses on the brink of closing due to the COVID-19 economic crisis. She's calling for corporations with payrolls of $7 million and up that offer employees annual salaries of less than $500,000 but more than $150,000 to be taxed 0.7%. The tax is twice as much for companies paying employees $500,000 or more.
All right, so you put it up, Jumpstart. You got support. You got people like Expedia on board, and some everybody else. Of course, not the chamber or the DSA, but you got it through. And now, Jumpstart's there. What's your feelings about it? I saw, you sent a letter out. You Mama Bear around this Jumpstart money, huh?
Well, thank you. Thanks to the broad coalition of folks who really made Jumpstart possible. Let's start with the fact that we are in one of the most prosperous cities in the wealthiest nation in the country, in the world, and we do not have a progressive tax system. So, with that premise, wanting to move the dial towards a more progressive tax system, we advanced a payroll tax that only applies to the largest companies. We're talking about over 7 million in Seattle payroll, and a higher tax for those over 1 billion. And it only applies this tax to those employers if you have more than a six-figure salary, more than 150, more than 400,000. This is a one important tool for us to advance so that we can right side up our upside down tax system, where right now many homeowners who are struggling to make ends meet, pay mortgage, we're paying through property tax. Folks who are every day in the city of Seattle are paying the majority of taxes through sales tax. And who does that hit the hardest? Working families, Black and brown folks, folks who are struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over their head. We have got to fix this tax system. So I'm really proud, and I am Mama Bear about it, to make sure that it gets implemented and that the funding gets to the people who are in need. I want to talk about the long-term investments, but just very briefly, the short-term investments were so critically needed for housing assistance, food assistance, rental assistance, direct cash assistance. For the love of God, just trust people who need those dollars to put those dollars to good use. And that is part of what the Jumpstart money did. It had cash assistance, rental assistance, food assistance, immigrant and refugee, and small business and childcare support. But long term, what the Jumpstart progressive revenue proposal is going to do in 2022, if the implementation and spending plan is adhered to, is it's going to actually invest in the social housing that our city so desperately needs. We're talking about building affordable housing, rental units, yes, but also first-time home ownership opportunities. We're talking about making sure that there's land available to places like Africa Town and Chief Seattle Club and others who have projects that are ready to go. They just need additional assistance to build that housing. And we're also talking about doing it in a green way. There are Green New Deal elements in the bill, and I want to thank my colleagues who helped to improve the bill as it moved forward. Green New Deal and equitable development initiative language was in from the beginning, and we beefed it up before we passed it. This is a really important first start, but $214 million. People asked us before we got it passed, why are you doing this now? Is this the right time? You know, look, the recession's on the horizon. Is now the right time for a payroll tax? It is absolutely the right time in the city where we have a large number of companies who are benefiting from having their employees be able to work at home full time, and to see the tech industry continue to make record profits. Okay, we want to support profitable economic activity in the city of Seattle, but it needs to be paid back into the city so that we can have both an infrastructure and support to the residents and workers here. It's the right time to do it. It was the right proposal. It's right in terms of being just, and it's going to make the right investments in housing and creating more economic opportunity. And as you know, as we were talking about at Town Hall, trying to right those historic wrongs for who's been kicked out and who's been prevented from living and affording to live in the city of Seattle.
Right. Yeah, man. Your hats off to you for sitting on there. I actually got a clip from that town hall here later if we get to it. But speaking of the Jumpstart tax and speaking of money and investment in community, let me play this here and we'll talk about it on the other side.
Our budget makes a lot of hard decisions. But if we want a more equitable city when we recover from this crisis, we must make real our promises to our BIPOC communities. We need deep and lasting investments, and we must empower community to guide those investments. That is why my budget commits an additional $100 million in new spending for Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color. It will invest in building opportunity and an inclusive economy, community wealth building and preserving cultural spaces, community wellness and safety, environmental justice, and a Green New Deal.
Hey, man, you guys kind of sound like you're saying almost the same thing. But what do you think now of this $100 million investment? I don't know if you caught the beginning of the show, but the mayor released her task force here, actually at the top of the hour, about 25 members on it, representing, I guess you would say, a BIPOC community. What are your thoughts on the mayor's $100 million investment into BIPOC communities?
Well, first of all, the money and the investments are needed. There's no question about the need to make sure that we are filling gaps that have been created by decades of disinvestment into our community. But where that money comes from is the $100 million question, right? Commitment was made to $100 million without really identifying a potential revenue source. And while Jumpstart was criticized by the mayoral administration, ultimately not vetoed, what we're seeing now is the use of $100 million coming from otherwise what would have been the payroll tax investment.
So let me jump in. Let me jump in here real quick. You know, I'm always good for reaching out to people. So I reached out to the mayor and I said, hey, I want what's the clarification and where you guys are at. I know you can't read this here on the screen, but I'm just letting people know. You know what I'm saying? I reached out. Kelsey over in the mayor's office got back to me, and basically what Kelsey was saying here was that basically what they're saying is it's all in the same pot. They're like the money's the payroll tax, similar to all other taxes without voter mandated spend, is deposited in the general fund, and the general fund does not distinguish between revenue sources. Is basically what they're saying. And then one other thing, what the mayor's office is saying is stood out to me is that they're saying that the investment, the mayor made clear, blah, 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 sorry about this, with regard, we believe that the intent of the 100 million for BIPOC communities aligns with the council's priorities as described by their legislation. And that was, she points out to part of your legislation here, which talks about funding community programs and everything else, that the 100 million is aligned with the legislation that you guys put out.
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we resist any of the efforts to engage in sort of a scarcity mentality, right? There should be enough funding for us to be able to invest both in the historic investments that are needed in Black and Brown communities, but also to make sure that the investments that we know are needed and were needed prior to COVID are actually invested in. So let me break that down just a little bit. I haven't had the chance to look at your email, but I think if folks tune in to tomorrow's council presentation, you're going to get an overview of where all of the streams of revenue are coming from in the mayor's proposed budget. And just to sort of put it in everyday terms, right? For you, for me, for folks watching at home, the last place that we are ever going to go to buy groceries or pay for rent is going to come from our savings account, right? Everything else we would want to have spent our budget for weekly, monthly uses. So it is not actually fair to say that the money isn't coming from Jumpstart investments, because what we had proposed in the Jumpstart proposal was to have a progressive payroll tax, pay for things like what I just talked about, rental assistance, food assistance, cash assistance, childcare, and small business assistance. And then this next year in 2021, to make sure that 70% of those funds were going into core government services. And that includes things like libraries and parks, childcares, making sure that early learning remains open, small businesses have assistance, and that we create those core government services that we know families will need extremely with extremely high rates next year, because the recession will continue and the impacts of COVID will be felt next year. So it's not just COVID response, but how do we shore up and protect core government services that largely also benefit BIPOC communities? That was the proposal. And so to say that it aligns with sort of the values isn't necessarily fair, because the council put forward a strong, robust spend plan. And you all probably remember just as much as I do, it feels like it just happened yesterday, when we were dealing with the employee hours tax from 2018. And one of the biggest criticisms that folks said was, you don't have a spend plan. So the first thing that we did was create a really robust spend plan for the Jumpstart payroll tax. It is important for the folks who worked in that coalition, and I think the council members who unanimously supported the spend plan, that type of spend plan stays adhered to, because it's always housing and it's always Green New Deal and equitable investment ideas that people say, that sounds like a good idea, but we're going to put that on the back burner. And we cannot continue to allow housing and equitable development and Green New Deal principles to be put on the back burner year after year after year. That was the purpose of Jumpstart Spend Tax. So I am not saying that that it's an easy decision to make about where those dollars will come from, and it's not going to be an easy conversation that the council has in front of us. And I hope you all do tune in tomorrow to hear the city central staff's presentation on where those funds come from. But we have to recognize that it is absolutely but for the Jumpstart payroll tax that they are having dollars available. If we didn't have the Jumpstart payroll tax, there would not be those dollars to pull from. And it's important that we don't get into, Peter robbing Peter to pay Paul, or putting communities against each other. And it's especially important that we don't pit BIPOC communities against each other and investments that go into the very community.
It already sounds like it might kind of be a fight. But so I got a different question for you then. I mean, clearly you said that investment is needed. I think everybody agrees on that. City Hall, the mayor, community, and everybody else. A lot of the community said that they wanted SPD for these funds that are going into the community to come from the Seattle Police Department. What are your thoughts on that?
It is important that the city of Seattle continue to move forward with its investments into BIPOC communities, and recognize that those investments should also accompany a divestment from the historical vision of what public safety looks like. I think a lot of the reason that people are interested in seeing this type of reinvestment is we have just asked too much of 911. People are told to call 911 when they have a mental health crisis, a domestic violence situation, like Colleen just talked about before I came on. These are not situations where you necessarily need somebody coming into a situation that is going to escalate the tense situation in front of us. And I want to make sure that folks know that, especially for our homeless response system, having a police-led response system is something that the frontline providers have said does not actually help build that type of trust that we know people need in order to get into case management and to accept housing. And we have to build the housing and have enough shelters for people to go to, so we're not just moving people from corner to corner. So I think it's really important that we continue to look at the public safety investments, the divestment conversation as a public health issue. And I think the council is going to be absolutely taking that issue back up again this fall. And Councilmember Herbold, as chair of public safety, she's really leading our efforts along with other council members. Councilmember Morales is working on the investment into participatory budgeting process. But we have a call for action coming from the streets, and not just here in Seattle, but across the nation. And I think it's incumbent upon us to respond.
Right. And speaking of that, though, and if you talk about taking investment away from SPD, are you somebody who's like, okay, take away from SPD and now invest in Health One? I'll play this clip here in a second. Or is it like take away and give to community? In Portland, they have the street response program, which is basically like a beefed up Health One program here. But you did a ride along with Health One, and you talked about, I told you I watched the meeting, and you talked about it here last week.
Many folks know, as we talked this summer, about the need to have the opportunity to dial something other than 911 when we see people in distress. I mentioned the case of an individual just around the corner from my house who appeared to be sleeping. He had his pants off and he needed help. That's almost the exact same call that we responded to today on the Health One ride along. An individual in distress, disoriented, along the pier, who needed help, and he sought out some bystander to call to get him help. And it was the Health One van who called. They brought him pants, they brought him socks, they got his daughter on the phone, and really did a warm handoff to the King County team who was getting him into shelter.
All right. So when we talk about moving funds from the Seattle Police Department, are you an advocate of making Health One more robust? Or are you an advocate of working with some of these community organizations, and the community are the responders and they respond like maybe a Health One does?
I think it can be both and, but I think that the emphasis needs to be in the latter. I think we need to make sure that we're investing in community-led solutions that have trusted community partners, that have the solutions, that have been working to build trust among community members who know exactly what is needed. And people talk about how do we scale up capacity. There's a lot of capacity right now in our BIPOC community, folks who are already trying to provide assistance with housing, food, education, job opportunities, creating pipelines to good living wage jobs. These are the type of investments that if we make early and invest directly into BIPOC communities can help create greater economic stability and frankly, also reduce the chance that somebody in the community is going to have to come into contact with a ever-growing police presence. So I think it is absolutely about investing first into our BIPOC communities. We've heard directly from folks in community right now who are leading programs on gun violence prevention, on healthy relationships, on making sure that people have economic stability and job training opportunities. These are the things that we need to have basically self-determination and greater self-sufficiency. And then when we do that, we lessen the presence of traditional policing in our street as well. When we talk about lessening the presence of traditional policing in our street, that's why I think it's perhaps a both and invest in things like Health One. Then a cop is not being called when somebody is sleeping homeless in the street. An officer is not showing up with a gun when it's a situation where somebody is isolated in their home and perhaps maybe self-destructive or is in a depressive state. You need someone who's going to be able to walk in or walk up to that person and create a trusting relationship and help get them connected to appropriate housing, appropriate case management. And I think a really great example is the clip that you played, where I saw somebody who was elderly and he really just needed to talk to his daughter. He was distraught that he couldn't find his daughter. He didn't have his pants on. He had wristbands on from being at Harborview very recently. And when we just call 911 and have officers show up to a situation like that and move people off of benches instead of trying to figure out how to move them into housing and case management, you are actually increasing the chance that somebody's going to continue to see police over and over. They're going to get a record. Something worse could happen to them. They could end up, being harmed. And what we actually need is to create trust, case management, and get folks inside. And I think that when we do that, it also decreases the dollar amounts that the police department would ultimately need because they're responding to fewer calls that should be handled by community partners and or those first responders in the end. But to your question about sort of where that balance happens, I think it's absolutely first investing in those trusted community partners and then having the safety net, the backstop be those who are showing up without arms.
Right. And, I've been hogging a lot of the time here. I know Triana has some questions.
Hey,
Yeah.
Triana.
Hi. My big question to you, and thank you so much for so much of what you've said. It is clear that there's a real need for housing. I mean, you and I have been in meetings about this, and honestly, I just wanted to uplift that. And I heard you talking a bit about that. Tell us a little bit more about what it's going to look like in terms of some of those home buyer opportunities.
Ooh, yes. Yes, would love to. And I think when we talk about first-time home ownership opportunities, the term equity comes to mind, right? How do you build equity so that you have something to pass on to your kiddos or the next generation? How do you use equity to get out of generational poverty? In this country, one of the very few ways to actually build equity and get out of generational poverty is to have your home, to have property, to be able to pass something down. Property acquires value, unlike something like investing in a car, which we know decreases in value year after year. So yes, we want communities to be able to acquire equity in the ways in which they have not been able to because of historic redlining, racist covenants, exclusionary lending policies, all of these pieces that have prevented generations from Black and brown folks from being able to even acquire the resources to then be able to purchase a home because they've been excluded from buying in many parts of our city. That is critical for us to address. But I also like to use the term equity in the social justice way. It is an equitable effort for us to say we must build more housing and home options. And that includes rental units, but also first-time home buyer options, and change our zoning throughout the city so that 75% of our existing city residential land is not exclusively zoned for detached single-family housing, and that we instead allow for it to be more inclusive, duplexes, triplexes, apartments, flats. We want there to be a whole host of affordable options across the spectrum for a community to be able to purchase. And we are doing a lot of that through the Jumpstart investments. In 2022, the investments really begin to look at investing into affordable housing, creating first-time home ownership, and land acquisition, right? One of the first things we did, I know you've been a part of these meetings where you were all really pushing for us to do this, stop selling city public land to the highest bidder and hold on to that land and give it to organizations, do either long-term leases or sell it off like we're doing right now with Bird Bar, so that people can have that land in their hand and build what they know they need for community. That's true of Africatown, Bird Bar, Chief Seattle Club I mentioned earlier, so many others. If we can just help make that land more available and affordable to community partners who want to build housing through the lens and with the sort of cultural values that are associated with that housing, we can create more Roberto Maesta places. We can create more places that are developed by Africatown and folks, where then you have childcare and small businesses that are associated with it, community centers on the first floor, and you create more first-time home ownership opportunities. And if I could have one more second on this,
Sure.
This also gets directly back to the housing and homelessness crisis that we have in this city. People are like, well, what, why are there so many homeless people in the city of Seattle? Can't they just go into a shelter? Our shelters are at capacity. They were at capacity prior to COVID. And if we don't have an exit plan, if we don't have a light at the end of tunnel for folks who are currently in shelters to get into affordable housing or permanent supportive housing, if we're not building that housing, then those shelters will continue to stay at capacity. And those who are either falling into homelessness for the first time or chronically homeless, there's not going to be an exit plan for folks. Building opportunities for people to have their first-time home ownership creates greater housing stability, gets them away from the housing discrimination issue that we know renters face, and renters are more likely to be Black and brown folks, LGBTQIA folks, and folks with disabilities. Let's create first-time home ownership opportunities, and that's what we're investing in. But it's just a first step. There's so much more needed, including changing these dang zoning laws.
Right, Council Member. I know they said it was a hard stop. You got 5 more minutes for us?
Sure,
We just got a
why
few more
not?
important questions. A reoccurring question is about actually the West Seattle Bridge, and and actually we got quite a few viewers over there in West Seattle and supporters on that side. You're chair of the Budget Committee. What's the word on the bridge?
Well, I also live over here in West Seattle. Folks might know that I live in that pocket neighborhood just where the bridge touches down. So I too am affected by the long commutes if we're trying to get into the core of the city. And right now, what we're doing is working with the chair of public transportation, that is Councilmember Peterson, and also Councilmember Herbold, who is out here in District 2, who've been really leading the efforts. I know that they're staying in close touch. I think that we're going to get word here very soon. And perhaps you all have been also tracking this and are up to date on any of the recent announcements. But the biggest question is, can they do repairs versus tearing it down and building anew? It sounds like they've learned more recently, as I'm sure you're able to comment on as well, about the ability to do those repairs. I also think, though, it's important that we ask the question, if we're going to invest in repairs and if those investments can happen in a quick way, how can we also simultaneously be having a conversation about where light rail should go? Because potentially there's an opportunity for us here to expedite the light rail conversation, which is a more equitable way for us to access public transportation and to make sure that people can get into our downtown core for childcare, like I was going to do before the bridge went down, and for job opportunities and getting to the hospitals, right? We don't have a hospital out here in West Seattle. And there's a lot that we're doing to make sure that it's safer out here, like some of the investments through the firefighters department. But we have to make sure that as we're investing in either a quick repair or a long-term effort, that we ask the question about how this can be tied to more public transit opportunities.
Right. And you're a big labor advocate. What's the relationship between yourself and SPOG, the Seattle Police Officers Guild, and the relationship there around contracts and everything else?
I am a big labor advocate. I came from the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO. I was a political director there for and lead lobbyist for 7 or 8 years. But there is a big difference in my mind about being an advocate for collective bargaining and labor rights and what is currently in question in terms of related to contracts for a guild. And we have to separate those issues and ask the question about how negotiations can happen on our collective bargaining rights, but also recognize that folks who have a badge and a weapon, it is important for us to have a contract and policies that protect the public and not necessarily just use collective bargaining as a justification to delay important reform measures. And that is, I think, an important distinction that will continue to play out over the next year here as we engage in collective bargaining. The contract is coming up for discussion at the end of the year. And just to be clear, though, I was not endorsed by SPOG, did not seek their endorsement when I ran. And I think that it is important for us to stand up always for collective bargaining rights in every workplace, including for our gig economy workers, because we know when we have a union, all boats lift. But I think that it is important to ask the question about how the collective bargaining and union rights conversation can be separated from reform efforts and accountability efforts that I think should, in many cases, be non-negotiable.
Right, and I have one more question that came off of Twitter, but I'll pitch over to Treyana if you had another question before we get out of here.
No, you know what? I mean, my question was going to be around the task force versus participatory budgeting.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, council member? You know, the mayor's put out the task force. It's about 25 people. Treyana, and she's part of King County Equity Now, and that group has been very vocal, like super vocal, about a participatory budgeting process. I know that you're a person who prides yourself as listening to community advocacy groups, and you got a listening ear and you're taking notes and everything else. We've got two processes right here, $100 million on the table. What are your thoughts? Task force, participatory budget?
So one of the things that I raised when we were first asking questions of the mayor's office 2 weeks ago in our committee hearing was, how is this work going to be done in a way that does not yet again ask community members, especially Black and Brown community folks, to be volunteering their time, having their time duplicated, and also not respecting the process that I think many community partners have asked for, which was a true participatory budgeting process. We are going to continue to move forward with supporting the participatory budgeting effort. You probably talked to Council Member Morales recently. She's helping to lead up the effort around investing in the participatory budgeting efforts, along with Council Member Herbold, who is working on the public safety reform issues. I really want to thank community members who have continued to say we need true participatory budgeting, especially as it relates to public safety issues. And, from my perspective, also as budget chair, we wanted to engage in more of a participatory budgeting process for the overall budget. And we had plans in February of this year, obviously with the change in economic circumstances and the work from home sort of mandates. Our participatory budgeting efforts for this year's budget did not happen, but it is something that I think we need to be applying to the entire budget at some point, but especially for the public safety investments. So to me, it's still critical. I'm going to still be supporting participatory budgeting, and I look forward to continuing to work with Councilmember Herbold and Morales as they continue to invest there. I should probably run pretty soon.
Here it is. Last question right here comes from the Urban Ace. He's actually been live tweeting this whole thing right here. The question is the council member going to run for mayor?
I am very happy with the current work that we are trying to do. I'm extremely fortunate to be able to represent all of Seattle. And right now I'm focused on getting a transparent, accountable, and robust budget passed that invests in communities, especially those who've been historically disinvested in. How about that?
That seems like we'll be following up with you.
All right, sounds good.
Council Member Mosqueda, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. And, feel free to drop in any time to keep the public abreast of this budget process, this very important budget process.
Thank you so much. And we do have public hearing again on the 27th, 5:30 p.m. We had 4.5 hours of public testimony last time with 155 people signed up. So if you want to join in, we look forward to hearing from you then or at the first 30 minutes of every meeting that we'll host.
All right, fantastic. We're going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we're going to give some thanks.